Now, I think when we talk about the great powers, now in the context would be the United States and China. In this Sino-US centric world, how ASEAN can fit itself and move forward. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of ASEAN, how can we have the future trajectory? Number one, I would say, why should we balance the two superpowers? Because I think since the very beginning, if we look at the history of ASEAN, in the 70s, the mood for ASEAN was to keep the great powers outside ASEAN. That's why we have ZOCFAN and TAC and so on and so forth. But then in late 80s and early 90s, we start to engage the great powers because ASEAN countries realize that we cannot prosper without engaging these great powers outside ASEAN. Number two, it reminds me somehow that philosopher Thucydides, when he said in the Melian Dialogue, that is, when he recorded the Peloponnesian War, that the strong do what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And then in this Sino-US world, of course, we are not the great powers. We are talking about the two great powers, the US and China, so that I think it really depends on the nature of the relationship between China and the US. If they have good relationship, then we are good. If they have strained relationship, it will affect us all, regardless of the fact that we want to be independent, we want to be neutral, we want to be in the central of all the matters in Southeast Asia. It will affect us in one way or another. Now, number three, we have to accept the fact as well that it is true that the US is in a relative decline economically, but the US remains the most powerful country on earth in terms of military. On the other hand, China will be the most powerful economically superpower, but in terms of military, China is still lagging behind the United States. So then the way the US engaged Southeast Asia and the way China engaged Southeast Asia would be different. China would use all the economic and development tools that actually are needed by Southeast Asian countries, while the US, of course, will be more having problem with this, and it's very difficult for the US to compete with China in Southeast Asia in terms of economic development assistance. Now, it's not only a matter of whether or not the US has the money or the resources to help Southeast Asian countries, but also it is probably because the nature of the political system. President Xi Jinping could just wake up tomorrow morning and decide to give $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion US dollar to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Indonesia, or whatever country. He could do that because the system is not a democratic system, while President Trump or previously Obama, they could get up every morning wanting to give money, but they have to go through all these democratic processes. And that's why the US would be slower than China in terms of having this charm, offensive diplomacy in Southeast Asia. So then it is a matter of national interest of each of the ASEAN countries because they need development. We could not deny that. It's a basic interest of every country. Of course, security is one of the interests, but in the end, it's about how to bring prosperity for countries in Southeast Asia. Number three, regardless of what I've been saying, that because of the nature of the global politics right now, EU has internal problems that they have to resolve. The US kind of refraining from its global role and so on. China is rising and so on. Now, we as well would not take for granted that China would be able to continue the economic growth because of, as we all aware, China has its own problem domestically. All this problem of inequality, disparity between regions, and so on and so forth, not to mention the possibility of regime change or political change that would affect how China sees the world and how China commit itself to the continued development in Southeast Asia. So then, what I'm saying is, regardless of the fact that the US is in withdrawal in Southeast Asia, I think ASEAN countries should also take precaution with China, because it has China has its own problem. Number 4, we've been talking about centrality and so on and so forth. I think there are 3 things that we need to take into account when we are talking about centrality in Southeast Asia in terms of ASEAN. How to sustain centrality, and how ASEAN could always be in the driver's seat. It is something that needs to be earned. And then there are 3 modalities I think that needs to be there. Number 1, actually external powers acknowledge that China and that ASEAN should be maintaining its centrality. They are part of this TAC. China, the US, and other great powers acknowledge the need for maintaining level of neutrality and centrality of ASEAN. So there's no problem on their part. The problem is probably, as Tamsak already mentioned, is probably within ASEAN. That's another discussion. Number 2, in order to maintain centrality, there has to be some collective political will among ASEAN member countries to uphold this principle. And we could discuss that in the Q&A. Number 3, there needs to be an autonomy from any form of coercion. And it is a matter of domestic political orientation of each ASEAN country. Now, in order for these 3 requirements to have centrality in ASEAN, ASEAN needs a strong leadership, something that ASEAN, I think, now is lacking in the past few years. ASEAN started as a club of dictators, I should say. Mahathir, Suharto, Marcos, and then Lee Kuan Yew, and so on. They could just pick up the phone if there are problems, and then the problem will be put under the carpet, and as if there is no problem. But now, in the past 10, 20 years, we've seen democracy come to some of the ASEAN countries, leaders come and go. So the atmosphere of shared interests and shared goals among ASEAN leaders now is much different from what it was in the past. So if it is the problem of leadership and the problem of our leaders, then I think what we need to have is a strong institutionalization of ASEAN, because we could not really rely, as we learn, on certain leaders for ASEAN to move forward. And there are some proposals on how to strengthen ASEAN institutionally. Number 1, changing or reviewing at least the way decision is made in ASEAN. And then, they've been talking about ASEAN minus X mechanism that in our charter, it is acknowledged to be used for economic cooperation. Maybe it's time to think whether or not we can apply this ASEAN minus X principle for political cooperation. And that's, I think now we can review the ASEAN Charter, because we missed before. This is the year, every 5 years we can review the Charter actually. Number 2, if we look at the contribution fee of ASEAN members, it's only 1.6 or 1.8 million US dollars, so $2 million US dollars. So ASEAN member countries only provide 20 million US dollars for the secretariat. It's too small for a big organization with big goals. And that's why then we rely on our external partners in financing so many activities and so many things that ASEAN must go through. So this is something needs to be fixed. Number 3, the proposal, this is not coming from me. CSIS is part of the network of the think tank of Southeast Asia. Maybe you've heard about the ASEAN ISIS Forum, ASEAN Institute of Strategic and International Studies, the white ISIS, not the black ISIS in the Middle East. We put this recommendation to the leaders already. We hope that they will discuss in the next few days if they listen to think tank. But these proposals of strengthening the secretariat is very important, because ASEAN countries need to put money into where their mouth is. If we are not doing that, we will continue to depend on external powers, be they the US, China or others in financing our own activities, and then that's opened the way for interference from great powers into the region. Should stop there. Thank you very much.